And, modernism, as we will have discussed in the Second Viennese School, equals elitism. Elitism. That is, not everyone is welcomed to appreciate and get this style. It expresses the artist's inner self to other people who get it, to other like-minded artists. So a modernist approach means that, yeah, I'll write music and the average person might listen to it, but if you know what I'm doing, you'll get the most out of it. Stravinsky has a long career. Like Haydn, you can't just put him in one box and say you're done, because his career is so long, it spans different artistic developments. So if you talk about l'histoire de soldat, the story of the soldier, the soldier's tale. While Stravinsky was a Russian, Igor Stravinsky hated the Soviets and completely rejected and refused to have anything to do with the nationalist styles. What did he decide to include in this music post Rite of Spring, post Firebird? We're talking in the 20s, 30s, 40s. Stravinsky says, I will give you a clean, new cosmopolitan style. And others like Bela Bartok and, for example, the Concerto for Orchestra do the same things. Let's have surface references to Greco-Roman classic culture. Let's look way back, kind of neoclassical, sure. Let's use purely diatonic means, and let's have classical Mozartian arched melodies. Wow, this is neoclassical, yeah. The old past styles that we had before are just as good as your new style. This is actually postmodernism. We'll see it in a specific lecture. Let's take the old styles and let's have the new styles. To you, this seems normal. Old songs, new songs. Old movies, new movies, because we have recording devices and this can happen. We live in a postmodernist artistic environment, but this was a big deal. Music in these old styles is not just always about you. The composer does not have to be the hero. Just grab whatever music you like and do it. Doesn't matter what style it was. The third part, we would mix up the serious bits of music with banal modern references. So you have chord progressions that sound old, good old harmony, 4, 5, 1, and then you do repetitive ostinatos, for example. You repeat something sort of that sounds like settee. The French neoclassical, let's repeat it over and over again. And it's up against what seems to be serious, solid, real stuff. Is that satire? Or is it just kind of there? Like having an old couch that's an antique sitting next to something from IKEA. Do they just sit there? Do they quarrel with each other? Are you making a joke about old couches by having a new one? There is no difference between popular and serious music. Why make these meaningless distinctions? Pop music, serious music, it's all good. There is no difference between music of nature and culture. So the primal things we did in primitivism, primal music, primal emotion, great. Cultural things, let's discuss philosophy and go to plays and things, good. It's all inclusive. So in l'histoire de soldat, Soldier's Tale of 1918, see, it doesn't actually get us that further along in the 20th century. We have a musical event that is actually narrated, read. There's a spoken part. It's danced. It can be danced. I remember seeing that when I was an undergrad. Somebody performed it, and it's performed. 7 players and a narrator. It's a story about the soldier who gives his violin to the devil in exchange for good fortune. Eventually the soldier gets taken off to hell, because you should never give your violin away to the devil. It's a long story. In this work, it's divided up into movements, and listen to the names of the types of movements: chorale, tango, waltz, ragtime. Chorale, church music. Tango, pop music of the time. Waltz, old pop music from the 19th century. Ragtime, cutting edge, new stuff. Does Stravinsky really know how to do ragtime? We'll see. This really is a piece of French neoclassicism. He's in Paris, he's writing these styles, but these same ideas will carry him further into modernism in the 20th century, into the 1950s. And he will evolve into music that is not meant to express anything. A style hand in hand with the absolute music of the past. Absolute music, remember, 19th century? For the objective modern listener. Old music repackaged for you in the mid-20th century. No nuance, no subjectivity, no subject. It's not about anything. That moment when Beethoven's Third Symphony said, "It's about the hero." Done. Over. At least in Stravinsky's world, mid-century. It is self-sufficient. You don't have to know what the Tristan chord is. You don't have to know it because it's not in this piece. You just sit here and listen to this piece and it is what it is. This is the preparation to launch us into the next video lecture, the new objectivity or high modernism. We move to Bela Bartok and the Concerto for Orchestra. Concerto, how 18th century classical Mozartian does that sound? The 19th century, we saw the concerto as a vehicle for superstar soloists. Why is somebody in the 20th century writing a concerto, and let's call it a concerto for orchestra? It's like an old concerto grosso in a way. This is not written for a Baroque-sized orchestra. This is written for a modern orchestra, and yet it's called a concerto for orchestra. It's a neoclassical reference to the old concerto grosso. Oh, remember those days when we did concerto grosso? But now here we are in modern times. We must make it modernist. So we just refer to those old things. We don't dive in like Mendelssohn and say, I'm going to reproduce it. No, we just say, yes, those little things, and I refer to them in my compositional style. Bela Bartok is a Hungarian composer interested in folk music and old things, is one of those people who are recording folk song and trying to catalog them before they disappear, along with Ralph Vaughan Williams at this same time, among others, and Kodai. They're trying to record things that they sense are passing away with the industrialization of Europe. Bela Bartok is also interested, clearly, in neoclassicism, or he wouldn't have written this piece. Give it a listen. I think you have to listen to the fourth movement, which is in your anthology, so you need to listen to this. It's on your list. You will hear this same reference to Greek and Roman things, that is, diatonic scales, like Greek and Roman columns. We can't say it sounds like Greek and Roman music for sure, because we didn't write that down. Nobody recorded that. But this is what we're assuming. I think it must have been diatonic, and the symmetry of architecture in ancient Greece. That's how I should construct my melodies. So we hear Bartok doing some very interesting things. Not only does he use diatonic elements, but he actually uses new synthetic scales. He constructs scales. This is the right time period. Stravinsky, Bartok, these folks are using synthetic new scales like the octatonic scale. Remember that one? Whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, until it repeats itself. 8 different pitches before it repeats. There is no leading tone in an octatonic scale because it's always whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole. Half of the octatonic scale is a beautifully symmetrical tritone. The other half is a beautifully symmetrical tritone. There is no point in the octatonic scale that is not like the other ones. That is beautiful. That is symmetry. But it is not completely tonal in the 18th century sense. Remember how the major scale is constructed? A tetrachord, whole, whole, half, whole. Oh, so whole, whole, half. Weird hole in the middle, whole, whole, half. That's not exactly balanced. Scale degree 1, scale degree 5. That's 5 notes. That leaves 4 notes over here. Octatonic scales, whole tone scales, even chromatic scales are useful because every part of it is like every other part. What will you hear in the Bartok Concerto for Orchestra? We will hear old harmonies, but they are made new in this way. And I'll restate this at the end of my sentence. You remember that the perfect fourth, ever since the Renaissance, has been dissonant. Remember, I would not let you write the perfect fourth in species counterpoint unless it was a passing tone or a neighbor tone or something like that. The perfect fourth has not been consonant since the Middle Ages. It is now, to Bartok, consonant again. Why? Because it is a clean, symmetrical, hollow, perfect interval. The perfect intervals, fourths, fifths, octaves, must be more ancient Greek and Roman than these thirds and sixths that are all decadent 19th century. So, first style characteristic, a new shaping of old harmonies, including a consonant perfect fourth. A new shaping of old harmonies, including a consonant perfect fourth. If the scales are symmetrical, the meters don't have to be. Here's point number 2. Asymmetrical meters, so 7, 8, 11, 16, things that don't divide up into nice 2s or 3s. Asymmetrical meters fit with repeating and interlocking melodic cells. So maybe I have a little melodic cell of 5 notes, and that fits in a measure of 5/8. And then maybe I layer it with a cell that takes 3 notes to repeat. And so that interlocks and it bleeds over into the next measure. So on the one hand, we have unbalanced, limping or lopsided meters, but those meters are locked into place by little melodic note groupings that make use of those meters. Third point for Bartok. Eastern European elements, like mode choices and meters, run parallel to this modernist view. He's using Eastern European modes when he's not busy making his own scales. For example, using harmonic minor, or using a scale like da 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 da, flat to the 5th scale degree, get to the 6th scale degree, da 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 da. These different kinds of modes that we haven't listed in church modes in our study, and we haven't cataloged them because they belong to a specific folk part of Europe. That's the problem with learning art music and not folk music thoroughly. Eastern European scales that come from Hungary, Romania, the Eastern Slavic nations, and meters that are used in Eastern European folk music. I remember taking ethnic dance as my PE credit when I was an undergrad, and we learned a spring dance from, I think it was from Romania, but I'm not positive, and it was in 11/8. And you might say, how could anybody dance in 11/8? And we just learned it. It was fine. But it's not if you grow up on a diet of all music must be in 3/4 or 4/4, because that's very Austro-German kind of view maybe of how folk music should sound. You would say, oh, that's so remote and exotic. Well, Bartok finds that the elements that are around him in his own culture actually fit well with the elements that the modernists want to bring in. So the third style characteristic, I'll say it again, Eastern European elements, like mode and meter, are parallel to the modernist scale and rhythm desires. So there is Bartok and Stravinsky. Let's pick up a little bit about Shostakovich. I'm actually trying to remember whether I mentioned Shostakovich in the Soviet realism video, but just in case I didn't, I'm going to mention him here. In Soviet realism, we had the dictate that composers must write music that is accessible to all the people. And the government, the Soviet government says that's what must happen. It must be accessible, it must celebrate the good of the state, it must suit us. And if it doesn't suit us, we will censor it and you, the composer. So let me talk a little bit about Shostakovich. And again, I'm sorry if I already did. At this point, I can't remember where I am in these videos. So Dmitri Shostakovich, 1906 to 1975. He was trained in the Soviet Russian realist style, and he was promoted as a key figure of Soviet realism. His final exam piece was the First Symphony. It met with world renown in 1926, and so it was a chance for the Soviet government to say, see, we've trained musicians under this new system, under this new edict, and look, it's great. It's great music, and it does all the things we want it to do. In that First Symphony, not only are Soviet realist ideals, that it's accessible to the people, it's big, it's joyful, you can get into it, but also we hear Shostakovich's own sense of sarcasm and maybe ironic humor. We hear something of the composer in the music. Big surprise, we would hope to hear something of the composer in the music. What goes wrong for Shostakovich in some ways, in a lot of ways, is his creation of an opera called Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk District in 1932, just a few years after his glorious First Symphony, and he's hailed as a new composer of Soviet realism. So in Lady Macbeth of the Mtsensk District, we're supposed to think of Macbeth like Shakespeare's Macbeth. Lady Macbeth was the ambitious sort of character, driving character behind Macbeth's murder of the king and his goal for ambition. So we're supposed to think of that. The plot, however, goes like this. Katrina is a murderer. Well, this isn't how the plot goes, but let me start again. Katrina is the central character in this work. She is a murderer. We see that as the opera unfolds, and she turns out actually to be the most human and sympathetic character in this opera. We find ourselves actually sympathizing with a murderer. She exists in a sort of inhuman world. The opera was notorious. It was shocking. It was vulgar. It was explicit. There are a couple licks where the trombone is glissing upward, and this is meant to mimic a moment of sexual excitement. So it's as blazingly sort of pornographic as you maybe could get in classical music, I guess. Stalin, who is the absolute ruler of the USSR at this time, is not impressed by this. In fact, he's disgusted. This is terrible. This is garbage music. This is worthless. And so Shostakovich is officially reproved in the state-run newspaper in Pravda. Pravda is the name of the newspaper. So he got a bad review. But this is more serious because this is not the free press. This isn't just your local concert reviewer. This is the state speaking through a state-run newspaper. There is no freedom of the press. The government decides what to print and what people will read, and to some extent what people think. So Shostakovich is blamed for this terrible thing. If you've read George Orwell's 1984, the phrase "Big Brother is watching," this really fits. Orwell is writing about this kind of dictatorship. So you'd better watch your step, Shostakovich, because you'd better not do these kinds of really decadent, disgusting artworks ever again, because you know what could happen to you? You could just disappear. We could kill you, we could arrest you, we'll send you maybe to Siberia, to prison. And in fact, Shostakovich expected at every moment to be arrested for this, after this review. And forever after, it seems, he felt under threat. Shostakovich eventually then writes, he's very timid to compose, writes a fourth symphony that again does not really get approval from the state. It ends in a kind of somber minor, soft, chromatic-y, meandering thing. But it doesn't do what it needs to do. Hang on, let me find my other notes on Shostakovich. His fifth symphony is sort of like he says to the state, okay, I'll do it your way. Yeah, I've seen the light. I'm going to fix my errors, and I'm going to write you a great piece. And the Fifth Symphony does the things that Soviet realism says that it must do. It's big, it's joyous, it goes from minor to major, it ends with this really brilliant major sort of big brassy thing. It's really kind of sprawling, as a matter of fact. I feel like I've got some good notes in here that I wanted to say. Here it is. It's transfigured into the major key. Everything is just glorious, and it's like the big dictator of the state. So maybe he caved in and said, my own artistic ideas are not as important as the ideas of the state. Or did he? That's the question. And it's one of the questions that people can debate endlessly, I think. If it's so glorious and so great, the shoe really pinches, we might say, in the finale. That is, you get to the finale, and I think even in the third movement, and you start to think, is this so glorious? It's actually a little too glorious. I use this piece, the fourth movement, in my humanities class when we're talking about satire, because as this sprawling finale unfolds and unfolds, there is too much going on. It's too major. We hear do, re, mi, fi so often. This major scale is made too major. Scale degree 4 is raised. The woodwind parts, especially in the finale, keep breaking in and over again, over again, over again, over again. There's too much motion. It's got too much momentum. It's frantically trying to do all this. You said you wanted glorious music. Okay, here's glorious music. Here's glorious music. It's too much. Too much. And even by the time we get to the glorious last few chords, and don't get me wrong, it is really fun to play that as a brass player. It's like, yeah, I'm going to just play really loud and it's okay, finally. I can play this glorious major cadence, this diatonic D major chord. But what happens while the brass are playing the major chord? There's a repeated I know you want me to stop. I want to stop too. It's like stabbing. This, I think it's an A. It stabs all the way through and it never stops until the end. We keep waiting for 5-1 and a sense of rest, and instead we keep this ba 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 ba. It just keeps stabbing. How do we take that ending? Even the final cadence, if you wanted to just look at Roman numerals, the final cadence is a 5 of F sharp major, that would be a C sharp major chord, going to D. Sorry, that means major, scale degree 7 chord. I don't even have a name for that. Scale degree 7 is supposed to have a diminished triad. Or if you're going to go 5-1, A major to D. No, C sharp major to D. Every note in it acts as a really horrid leading tone to every other note in the D major chord. You just slide up by a half step, and it feels kind of forced and kind of like you're being made to do this. You must resolve and you will smile. Like being at Disney, for example. You go to Disney World, and if you're not smiling, some employee will stop you and say, why aren't we smiling? You have to smile. And there's this weird obligation that everybody must look happy here, because otherwise something bad could happen. Maybe I'm a little pessimistic at Disney World. So why are we so eager to say that this is satire of Shostakovich, that he's being satirical? Well, maybe we root for Shostakovich as an individual to sort of have his revenge on Stalin, to stand up for himself against Soviet realism. Shostakovich labels this symphony as a Soviet artist's reply to just criticism. That's his own sort of label for the symphony. A Soviet artist's reply to just criticism. It's like, okay, You slapped my wrist, and okay, I'm writing this symphony. You're right. Here's how it should go. But does it? Does it work? The thing is, the Soviet dictators and people in charge didn't notice the satire. They were like, yeah, he really totally did what we wanted him to do. See? Now he's doing what we said. Shostakovich, maybe he is, and he's also leaving part of himself in there. It's hard, I think, for many of us to say for sure, because if you were brought up, say, for example, outside of the USSR and viewed that as a system of great personal oppression, you would be inclined to read this symphony as Shostakovich sort of standing up against the big brother idea. If you were in the Soviet Union and said, well, this is glory, this is us, this is our musical style, you would not necessarily read it that way. So it's troublesome. Shostakovich, I must also say, at one point, he had said to an interviewer, and then he retracted it later, but he said this. He said, it's like being hit with a stick and being told your business is rejoicing. And you wander off muttering, my business is rejoicing, my business is rejoicing. Be happy, be joyful, write great music, and be happy about it. Bam, 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 go off and do it. And so you're so beaten and shocked and frightened and hurt that you're just like, okay, I'm happy. This is great. I'm happy. Yes, I can write this music. So the question is, if it's something hidden inside the Symphony No. 5, then it's not just Soviet realism, because Soviet realism is supposed to be obvious and all on the surface. We all get it. If Shostakovich has hidden himself in it, has hidden his satire and his commentary, that actually makes it a piece of modernism. It's elitist only if you hear the satire, only if you know that he's really saying something else. Then you get it. If you don't perceive it, you just think, what a glorious D major sort of piece. So that's why I've put it in this sort of bit of modernism, this sort of coda to the Second Viennese School and to neoclassicism. It's these three pieces, Stravinsky, Bartok, and Shostakovich, in their own ways do modernist things.